G'day Dons fans and welcome back to Don the Stat. Easter Sunday didn't exactly go to script, but depending on what script you were reading, that might be a positive. A 34-point loss might have been better than many expected, but a 7-goal-to-1 first quarter was nowhere near the start we'd hoped for. A microcosm of our season so far, the game had some of our worst football of season 2026, but it finished with some of our best. And that doesn't gloss over the start, it doesn't change the result, but it gives us something to build on as we head to Adelaide for Gather Round to take on the D's, hoping to win our first game of the season and our third Gather Round victory against Melbourne. I'm Jonathan Walsh, and joining to talk me through it all is my co-host Ian Hume. Humey, how's things?
Doing very well, Jono. I'm just getting ready to make it over to Adelaide for my third Gather Round appearance. It's always been a fun time these past 2 years, and here's hoping we can keep our Gather Round streak going against the Demons. How are you doing, Jono?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, mate. This is always the time of the year, 2 days out, talking to you when you're about to head across to Adelaide, that I start to get real Gather Round envy. Every year I've sort of declined the opportunity to get across, and every year I regret it. So I'm excited for you, but I'm also a bit jealous that you're heading over there, mate. I would like to be there myself, but looking forward to watching the game nonetheless.
Me too. Look, before we start, as always, I'd like to acknowledge those who have signed up to the Patreon this week. This week, that is Rusty, Jack French, Jono R, and Glenn Elkin. So thank you all for joining with us in the Patreon community. Also want to give a couple of shout outs to some random people I met in the street or around that were listeners to the show. I want to give a shout out to Anthony and his son Leo, who I ran into at High Point last Saturday. Anthony's been a long-time supporter of the show, and they were actually listening to us in the car before we ran into each other, which is a case of life imitating art. In a sense, he told me that he heard my voice trying to corral my two boys. I had to turn around and realize it was me. So that was quite interesting. And I also want to give a shout out to Shannon, who recognized me on the street the next day without hearing my voice. Somehow could tell what I looked like. Must be watching the show on YouTube, who also said he really enjoyed the show. It was just a couple of people just randomly recognizing me. As you can probably tell, my head has enlarged about 3 sizes, and I'm looking for you to bring me back down to earth, Jono.
Yeah, look, mate, you really are a man of the people. So, you've been enjoying pseudo-celebrity life, it seems. So, no, good on you, mate. And, thanks to those that have joined the Patreon this week. It's, the community continues to grow, but also continues to generate a lot of, really good and healthy and constructive discussion, which has been the best part, I think. Just riding the emotions of the game last Saturday was cathartic, but also a lot of fun and quite insightful. So it's, thanks to those that have joined and those that continue to stick with us.
Indeed. All right, Jono, let's get stuck into a game that didn't end as bad as we feared it might, especially after quarter time.
Yeah, let's do it, mate.
Well, look, I think we'll do it like we do first thoughts and start with the negatives, which really came down to what the Dogs were able to do at the clearance. And even without Liberatore and Richards, it was a real mismatch in the middle. Bontempelli started the years, really dominated us in that first quarter and set the tone. We really couldn't get our hands on the ball at all. The Dogs were able to get incredibly dangerous from clearance. So 3 of their goals came straight from the centre clearance in that opening quarter. And those goals are really deflating as an opposition because you set up in the middle, it goes down to your opposition's end, they kick a goal, and then you're back there trying to stop that from happening again. For it happened 3 times in one quarter from a source that generally isn't a high scoring source, although this year we have seen a growth in centre clearance scores. It is quite deflating, and it did really establish the gulf between the two sides in that opening quarter.
Yeah, you might have thought that given Bontempelli was sort of the star of that show, really. I mean, he's the star of every show that they play, but without Libba and Richards in that side, a lot more roads did lead to Bont. You might have thought that we would use that as an opportunity just to simplify things, lock down on him, and then just sort of worry about the rest. It looked like Caldwell had responsibility at centre bounce, but then Durham took responsibility for him around the ground as more of a high half forward rolling up. But we spoke in the preview that the Dogs like to hand over once the ball is in motion. Bont played a bit more like a high half forward post clearance. Fraser came up to run around more as a mid. So, we weren't really prepared for what the Dogs threw at us. Bont had 22 of his 35 in the first half. Fraser had 16 of his 26 in the first half. And it just gave them dominance at clearance and also outside post clearance. We lost clearance by 12 in quarter 1 and 6 in quarter 2. And you're right, it was a real double blow. That 3 centre clearance goals you mentioned, but we kicked 3 behinds in that first quarter, and the The Dogs scored goals from 2 of them, as well as 2 goals from throw-ins. So almost all of the damage was done from clearance and kick-ins. In fact, their first goal came from a kick-in, so we actually missed an opportunity to kick the first goal. They then went down the other end and scored a goal. Ball goes back to the centre. They kick a goal from that centre bounce. All of a sudden, it's 2 goals to zip, and then a throw-in, then a goal from a throw-in after that. And then they get another one from a centre bounce straight after that, and it goes out to 4 goals to zip. So, we're 4 goals down in the blink of an eye. We steady the ship for 5 or 6 minutes and at least settle things down. We score a goal ourselves, but then we score a behind. They kick a goal from that kick in and then immediately kick a goal at the next centre bounce. And at quarter time, it was ugly. So effectively, that had an opportunity to kick 2 goals in a row, bring it back on terms a little bit more, but we missed that opportunity. They kicked 2 goals, bang, bang, and it's effectively a 3-goal turnaround.
Yeah, indeed. And you talked about kicking there, and it was really noticeable, particularly in that first quarter, the gap in the way both teams approach kickouts. It's not a high score source for teams. So if you look at the averages across the years and last year and this year so far, most teams average under a goal a game from kick-in across the season. So it's not something that you generally see teams really dominating. Sometimes you'll see a team, kick a couple of goals and that'll be a high level of performance. But, we've historically struggled comparative to other sides. It's really noticeable how often we take that really slow, stagnant option, the kick into the pocket and then another slow kick or a slow kick back to the person who kicked it out, which makes it really difficult for us to get the length of the ground and getting into a dangerous position. And often we're either turning it over or creating a stoppage in the back half of the ground. So we're still fair away from goal. And then the flip side against the Dogs, we were really exposed. We gave up overall 4 goals from kick-ins. 2 were from that opening quarter, as you talked about, which is extremely high. It felt like we were caught out often by the way the Dogs are approaching their kick-ins and how easily they were able to traverse the length of the field. They're really quick at taking the ball, and they were ready to go. It's clear they've got distinct plans for taking kick-ins. It's hard to know whether it's a major concern overall or it's just what the Dogs are doing at the moment, having really good plans at kick out. They might get worked out by teams as the season progresses. They did this against Brisbane in round 1. So it's pretty good company to be with the Premiers in having a situation like this. If they couldn't work it out, that does suggest why we may have had trouble, but it is something to think about.
Yeah, just to sort of expand on that a little bit, the AFL average is 5.5 points per game from kick-ins. We conceded a goal a game in each of the first 3 games. So, marginally above the AFL average, but nothing dramatic. We scored 2 goals from kick-ins against Hawthorn, then 1 in each of our next 2 games. So from a score perspective, we've been, there or thereabouts, or in fact, slightly above the AFL average. I think we struggle or have historically struggled with moving the ball out of our defensive 50 often enough, but historically we've been at least able to score a couple of times from kick-ins. You're right, the Dogs scored 5-1 from kick-ins in opening round, and it was an area that we knew they could do real damage in going into the game. Not so effective in the weeks that followed, but we actually talked through their first goal in our Patreon video review. Edwards and Guelphy. So it was a kick-in after a set shot. I think it was Archer May who missed the shot. Edwards was our deepest forward. He went to the position that you would typically go to, and that is at the top of the goal square, that sort of first defender in the zone. I bet Guelphy, because he had the role on Bailey Dale, and Bailey Dale took the kick in. Guelphy went to the same spot, and that left space in the to one side for them to exit through. So it just created an area for the Dogs to go quickly into, and then does tracked Durham, that is tracked Bontempelli through the midfield and then into the Dogs 50, but then he went and ball hunted Durham and Bont just went around to the outside. They won the ball. He got the handball receive and was on his own when he took the snapshot at goal. And I think for me, that play actually typified 2 things that went wrong for us for most of the first half. We overcomplicated structures and that caused Guelphy and Edwards to go to the same spot and leave a hole. I think in normal circumstances, or Guelphy, would have gone to basically where the ball was kicked into. And that's on coaching, I think, not so much on the individuals. And then it opened up for the Dogs easily. And then Durham ball hunting, we saw too many. I think that the term I used in the review was that it was bees to a honey pot. Everyone was sucked in trying to win the footy, but not doing it. And then in doing that, if the Dogs won the contest, they had free players on the outside and they were able to punish us. And that's exactly what happened from that kick in.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, that first quarter was a pretty typical quarter for Essendon this year. And part of that was the way in which we were trying to use the ball. So we played that high handball game, 1.03 kicks per handball in that opening quarter, which is extremely low. And part of that was the pressure the Dogs were putting on us, and part of it was how we have wanted to move the ball so far this year. But post then, and probably halfway through the second quarter, and I think Brad Scott sort of spoke about this in his interview today, or his press conference today, then into the second half, there was a real shift. The kick to handball ratio was up over 1.5 for each of the remaining quarters, and we took more marks than the Dogs did in the final three quarters. So we did take a lot more out of the game and try to slow it down. We were actually quite effective with it, particularly I noticed in the second half, a lot of the switches that we did resulted in really good ball movement. There's been times in the past where we have tried to switch the ball and really gotten nowhere, whereas last week against the Bulldogs, when we did switch the ball, more often than not, we were then able to get it the length of the field into our forward 50 and into a scoring opportunity. So it was that change in ball movement that really contributed us getting back into the game. Obviously, we never really threatened a win, but there's a reasonable argument to suggest that post the first quarter, we were the better side out there.
Yeah, I'm still not convinced that the high handball game is by design. I think that's a byproduct of field position and a lack of contest and clearance win. Again, we demonstrated this a little bit on the video review on Patreon. In the first half, all of our numbers went inside the contest. If we didn't win it, the footy that is, the Dogs had the numbers on the outside. If we did win it, our numbers are in so close that it then becomes a hot potato. It's stationary. So in order to get the ball from the inside to the outside, you're having to get 3, 4, 5 handballs till you can get someone in the clear, and there's no real overlap run, no players coming from different angles to break that up. It's just so stagnant and stationary. Once we got a better balance of inside and outside the contest, our initial handball then put players out into space rather than, and not to mention we had room to actually run the ball out and kick as well. So rather than keeping the ball in congested areas. So I think halfway through the second quarter, we were minus 23 for contested possession. We were plus 3 after that. So I think for me, it was contest and clearance improvement that then enabled change in ball movement method rather than the design being changed. I think the other thing that happened was our pressure increased substantially, and that meant that we were winning the ball back in a bit more of, dangerous field position, and the Bulldogs were less settled and less, not so much in a position to be able to defend easily. So we were able to then move the ball faster and more accurately and more by foot because the Bulldogs weren't set up when we won the ball on turnover.
Yeah, and I think another thing that contributed to us getting back into the contest and back into sort of winning those contested spaces was when Peter Wright went into the ruck. And it feels like the past couple of weeks, we've really been able to get more into the contest around those stoppages when he's been in there. And partly that will be because he generally goes up against the opposition second ruckman. But overall, we just do feel more competitive in there. And, it's only part of the story. But in centre bounce ruck contests, we've won 10% more of the centre bounce clearances when he's in there compared to when Blackerson's in there. I think it's also made it useful for him around the ground. It gets him more involved in the game. He's had some pretty big intercept marks in defence these past couple of weeks. So I really think that he is functioning really well at the moment in sort of that second ruck role, and he doesn't have to necessarily be the number one forward and sort of get lost in the game, particularly with the way we've been playing recently. The ball's just not been getting down there.
Yeah, I think he's underrated as a ruckman. I think he's done a really good job for 2 years now as our backup or second ruck and probably underappreciated in that role. That aside, I think the other thing that he did was he demanded more of his opposition ruck. English largely ignored Blackiston, so English just dictated terms where he positioned himself in a manner that really disrupted our ball movement. So often in the first quarter, we had the ball at half back, we looked up and our only option really was to kick to where English was. What Wright did was he got more involved in dangerous positions. He'd go and get himself in the corridor. He would go and get himself available for a switch, or he would push forward. And that caused English initially and then their other rock options to start to think about where they position themselves in relation to Peter Wright. And Peter didn't always get used. In fact, rarely he did get used, but that isn't always the point, really. It really did do a good job of taking their ruck to other parts of the ground that then made it easier for us to move the ball once we had it in space.
Indeed. And, to, again, focus on the positives from the match, sometimes you do have to hold on to the small things. We spoke in the preview about how effective the Dogs have been in transition against us these past couple of seasons, particularly last year where both games we played them, the Dogs were scoring over 80 points per game from turnover. Last Saturday, we were able to hold the Dogs to only 26 points on turnover. And if you go back through the numbers, the only times in the previous 3 seasons that we've held a team to below 26 points on turnover, which is generally the biggest scoring source for most sides, that's been against teams like West Coast, North and Richmond, which are bottom 4 sides in those 3 years. So, it is something pleasing to take out of the game. And part of that probably had a way to do with we moved the ball. Was there anything you noticed different about the way we were able to defend turnover this week that we haven't done in previous weeks?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have a lot of the footy in the first quarter, so when the Dogs were dominant on the scoreboard, we weren't getting it in the first place to be able to turn over for them to then score from turnover. So that probably played a bit of a role. But look, it's not a particularly insightful answer. I don't think a whole lot changed in how we defended the ground. I think what did change was that our pressure was a lot better. Our pressure index was over 180. I think in the last 2 quarters, might have even been in quarter 2 as well, or at least in the second half of that quarter. We won 12 turnovers forward to centre in the second half. The Bulldogs only had 6 in the corresponding part of the ground. So better clearance and contest outcomes all added up to being better positioned to defend the ground when we didn't have the footy. I also thought, expand on this in a little bit, our forwards, whether it was inside 50 or up the ground, did a much better job of bringing the ball to ground. So we just weren't turning the ball over as frequently in dangerous positions that then allowed the Bulldogs to slingshot, and not necessarily through poor or slow ball movement or controlled ball movement, more just through winning the ball better and then pressuring better and actually being able to do a little bit of turnover damage ourselves. I picked up on a comment Brad Scott made in his press conference today. It's one I really agree with. And he said, paraphrasing a little bit, but when your pressure around the footy is better, your contest and clearance work is better, your defending gets better as well. So I think what we saw was a byproduct of being better around the footy that then transpired into other parts of our game.
Indeed. And I think part of that pressure around the footy was also brought about by the introduction of Isaac Kako into the midfield on the night. So Isaac didn't go into a centre bounce until the 12th centre bounce of the game, and we'd only won 2 of the 11 centre bounces up to that point. Isaac had 10 on the night, and when he was in there, we won 5 and lost 4. So in total, in centre clearances that Isaac wasn't there, we only won 3. So when he was there, even if he wasn't the one who was winning it himself, he was contributing to us winning more than we lost in that situation. So what was the difference that he brought, and how should we balance his midfield and forward time to get the best out of him?
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest with you, mate, whether this one is causation or correlation or maybe just a little bit of both. Probably is a little bit of both, but we did have better balance at centre bounce in the second half. And what Kako adds is a player who has some defensive awareness. We saw him actually go into the defensive sweeper role at times. He won a couple of one-on-ones in centre bounce contests, including one against Bontempelli, where he won the ball and got the clearance, which is a bit of a feather in his cap to be able to do that, especially given the size and experience differential. But I think to me, or to my eye at least, he effectively played as a midfielder in the first half, probably in a bit of a role that we've seen Nick Martin play in the past, sort of starting out of the centre bounce, but then rolling up. Fraser played a similar role for the Bulldogs. But again, I think we overcomplicated things, at least for Isaac. I think that's also part of his learning and development. But I did spot him on game day, and I think I commented to you a couple of times just how lost he got on turnover, trying to work out where he needed to go. And even at stoppage, he wasn't sure whether he should go and stand in an attacking position, a defensive position next to Fraser or round up somebody else. So I think we just simplified things a lot more after halftime. And the swap was effectively Kako for Durham. And that then had a flow-on effect. It also meant that Roberts, who for a lot of the first half was Fraser's direct opponent, he was then in a bit more of an accountable one-on-one role. And we freed up Zach Reid to be more of a disruptor in the zone and play a bit more of a freer role. And at least in the third quarter, he had 4 intercepts, which was twice as many as anyone on the ground in that quarter. So I think it was just that a combination of changes to simplify things. Kako midfield, Durham high half forward, taking responsibility for their high half forward. Roberts then playing a little tighter man on man rather than sitting off their high half forward. In the first half, he was a bit in no man's land because he wasn't sure, do I go in and man up Fraser, or do I go and get dangerous, or do I sweep? Langford sort of took a bit of responsibility at stoppage from a wing that then freed up Bailey Williams on a wing to get attacking as well. So there was a lot of chaos that we caused by just having things a bit overcomplicated in the first half that then simplified in the second half that I think all just compounded to give us a better result.
Indeed, and as you say, the better result was the ability to put scores on the board and really work the Bulldogs out a little bit. And one of the beneficiaries of that was the player who came back after his ACL injury at being a year out in Tom Edwards. It was great to see him out there and to get really dangerous. He's clearly a really intelligent, natural footballer, and when he gets them, he does take his opportunities. We also got to see a few good signs from May on the night, a couple of strong marks. And, we've got Caddy coming back this week, which we'll get into. It does give us some decisions to make about the composition of the forward line. We do have it sort of helps a little bit that Fiorini is currently out, which allows us to play Langford further up the ground and Wright is playing a lot more in the ruck. So it's worked for now. I've written here, certainly can't see all five playing in the side, given what we're about to talk about when we get to selection. That's based on circumstances of other players being out. But, as we get more players back and other players who can play roles that Langford and Wright are currently playing, there is going to be someone who misses out who probably won't deserve it based on what we've seen so far.
Yeah, it was a great return for Tom. Really happy about him and hard not to get excited about what he might be able to do and how he might help our team be more effective. You're right. He's getting scoring opportunities through just pure football IQ, knowing where to position himself, where to lead to, when to lead as well. He recognises the kicker and goes at them at the right time. He's not doing that through sort of brute force or athleticism or power. It's through real football smarts. I actually thought Archer May, but not just him, even Day Wicks and Guelphy Wright, even Perkins at times competed really well in the air and made sure the ball came to ground level. The Dogs only had 3 intercept marks in our forward 50, which is a win for us. We see or have seen teams intercept mark against us at ease. And I think that does need to be tempered a little bit by the fact that we only had 36 inside 50. So there weren't a whole lot of opportunities for them to mark. But nonetheless, we also had 13 forward 50 ground balls. Teams average a forward 50 ground ball, sort of one for every 3.5, 3.6 inside 50s. We got one nearly every 2.7. So our forward 50 ground ball rate was really strong as well. So yeah, you're right. They don't all fit. It's going to be a good problem to have as long as we don't try and make all the taller forwards fit or, spoiler alert, we kind of have this week once we get to selection. But nonetheless, I thought it was, really good to have Tom back and excited for what he can do once he's played, 30 to 40 games.
Indeed. And just sort of finishing up on the Bulldogs game, for a game we lost comfortably, we've actually been pretty positive about it tonight. And I think the reaction leaving the ground was pretty positive from Essendon fans. Are we right to be this way, or we're ignoring the big flaws we saw in the beginning of the game too much? We're clutching at straws because of what we've experienced so far this season, or was there something real about what we saw in that second half?
Well, I think to be honest, it doesn't matter what you and I think or what fans think. I mean, obviously we want fans being positive and thinking, going to games with hope and turning up in numbers and supporting our team. So I don't mean that quite as how it came out, but I think what matters most is what the playing group takes from it and whether they take confidence out of it to, and get some belief that, if we actually do switch on, we play the way that, we've trained and prepared to play, then good things happen. I don't think the problem for us has changed overall. When teams have momentum, we're not able to limit the damage the way the best teams do. We started okay. The first 4 or 5 minutes, you could see that there was a fair bit of heat in the contest. We were certainly cracking in. But once they scored their first goal, sort of from the 5th minute mark to the 17th, the Dogs scored 5 goals straight to 1 behind. Disposals were 10, 26 of their 32 were in their own forward half. So ball was going back to centre. They were getting it forward and it was staying there until they scored. Contested possessions were 32-12 in that sort of 12-minute period. And that's been a problem for us in every game we've played. The Bulldogs are better at it most because their ability to really hurt you from clearance and kick in, and therefore their damage was much more significant. I think we need to get better at getting the game back on our terms a lot quicker. I looked around, and again, I mentioned it to you and Andrew and James, who we watched the game with, and I looked around after they kicked their third goal. So it was the one that Bailey Williams kicked. And there was no leaders out there doing anything to sort of bring some energy. McGrath, to be fair to the captain, was on the bench at the time, so he couldn't really do much. Langford just meandered back to the wing. It was his opponent that kicked the goal, so he had, hands on hips, head down. Merritt just went to his fellow mids. I think it was Durham and Caldwell, who were kind of experienced enough, both in the leadership group too. So there was no on-field leadership to try and get around the young guys, try and build some spirits, reset the mindset. It just all felt going through the motions. And then, you go to the third quarter, we had a bit of luck. They didn't convert their chances, although we did a good job of limiting those chances to sort of parts of the ground that were harder to score goals from, sort of further out, wider on the ground. But we didn't do enough scoreboard damage for the play that we had. We had the ball in our attacking half of centre 29 times, but we only had 6 disposals inside 50. We scored 6 times. So, conversion once we were inside 50 was great, but we just didn't get enough supply inside 50 to really do damage. And I think they're the two things that need to improve in parallel. And once they start to do, a 6-goal loss can become a 2-goal win actually quite quickly, because it's, if you can improve those things at the same time, concede less when the opposition has momentum and then score more when we do have it. But yeah, that's the challenge for this young group. We know we don't have a depth of on-field leadership at the moment. So we are relying on that young group to develop that resilience and that ability to do that. And that's probably going to take another chunk of games. But yeah, let's put that one behind us, mate. Let's turn our attention to the biggest award in football, the Damien Barrett Lifetime Achievement Award. What caught your eye this week?
Well, this was a late nomination, Jono. I'd actually written in the running sheet that there was no award nomination this week. Then thanks to Jonathan Davies in the Patreon chat for the Damien Barrett Award for bringing up this stinker out of the Real Footy podcast from Peter Ryan, where he said that he worries about Kako and he doesn't kick enough goals. This is a second-year player. He played every game in his first season. He's come off an injury at the end of pre-season that he was flying through. He's already moving into the midfield and having an impact. So I have no worries about Isaac Kako at this stage. I think there's a lot of people who've just assumed he's a small forward, when in reality he's more that high half forward that gets involved up the ground and impacts in the middle, as I spoke about in the Bulldogs. I think if you had question marks over you can have question marks over a lot of Essendon players and what they're going to be. I think Isaac Kako is really well down the list of the players you have to worry about at Essendon going forward.
Two things here, mate. Firstly, I'm a little bit worried about Jonathan listening to a podcast that contains Sam McClure. So that's a query in and of itself. But yeah, it's a strange take. He had 5 shots on goal in his first game back. He kicked 1 goal 4, so he didn't have his conversion boots on. But yeah, he showed plenty in that game. I'm not worried by any stretch, let alone about the number of goals he's kicking for the reasons that you explained. I would like to see him get more of the footy, and that's the next stage for him, particularly as he plays more up the ground. I think good things typically happen when he has the ball, but he did only have the 7 disposals last week, so I'd like to see that increase, obviously. But that's okay. He's still a young player. He's still in his second season. He's only played the 20-odd games. He finished last season playing a similar role to the one that he's played the last couple of weeks. And his last 2 games last year had 19 disposals and 2 goals, and then 17 disposals and 1 goal. So I think you fast forward another 20 games into him, I expect that sort of high teens, a goal a game, to be his baseline output. And we've got a seriously good high half forward midfield rotation player on our list who does real damage when he has the ball. Can I throw a late nomination? I don't know who the person was, but there was a journo in Brad Scott's press conference today who asked if the club has a mandate on player partners attending matches, which I found quite a bizarre question that a journo would even think that might be a thing.
Indeed. It's certainly been the discourse around Essendon this week. I thought we'd get away with a little bit less given the improved performance this week, but obviously there's no Essendon angle that can't be done to death, although given the amount of publicity Gimlet has gotten from Essendon this week, I hope they do offer to host the club's Mad Monday at the end of the season. You mentioned Sam McClure there. When Jonathan posted it in the Patreon chat, he mentioned it had been Sam McClure who had said it, and I immediately thought about all the great things that I could say about Sam McClure, which I had to park once I listened to it myself and discovered it was actually Peter Ryan who said it. But I'm sure Sam McClure will give me an opportunity to release some of that A-grade material that I'm building up at some stage this year.
Yeah, the fact that he hasn't had a serious nomination yet, 5 weeks in, is actually a little bit disappointing. So, I'm sure that will change sooner rather than later.
Yeah, indeed. Just turning to some other news from the club this week, and obviously There was the announcement of both Angus Clark and Harry Jones getting injuries out of this week's VFL game. It was great to have that VFL game as a curtain raiser to the senior side. It should definitely happen more often, and to be able to get there and see, the senior listed players strut their stuff out there. Angus Clark developing a stress fracture and Harry Jones having a calf strain. Particularly Harry Jones, when he did start the game quite well, kicked a couple of goals in that first quarter. It is disappointing, and both of them currently are to be confirmed in terms of their return. Clark's stress fracture is in the foot opposite to his syndesmosis injury, so it is a double blow, given he worked so hard to get back, much quicker than anyone expected from that injury when he did it so late in the preseason. To have another injury interruption for a player that showed plenty of promise last year is really disappointing.
Yeah, look, it's hard not to wonder whether there's a link between Clark's new injury and coming back too fast. Nowhere near experienced or knowledgeable enough on that kind of thing to know, but I guess that's where the mind goes instinctively. But yeah, regardless, it's disappointing that he'll miss a chunk of footy. Yeah, and likewise for Harry, you want as many fit and available players in the VFL and as you possibly can, and have them to continue to be playing well and put their hand up, because ultimately competition for spots is what drives performance. So let's hope both are back sooner rather than later. I think in better news though, mate, Nick Bryan got hit through his first game back unscathed. Nick Cox got another game of footy as well on his sort of comeback trail. And Will Setterfield was back in full training this week. There's no VFL game for any team this week. It's a VFL bye during gather round, so they get the week off. But at least there was some good news in amongst the two lads that got injured.
Yeah, indeed. Look, we've focused a lot on poor media content this year with the Damien Barrett Award, but there is good things out there, and a lot of it does come from independent media and independent journalists really thinking about the game in more depth that it doesn't need to be relegated to a social media clip. And we're going to discuss one here that has come from Tommy Wolf over at the Reading the Play blog titled Hold the Line. So, unlike most of what we get from traditional football media, this was a really well-considered and thought-out argument about the way Essendon is approaching things and should be approaching things, really comparing Essendon to that Richmond period up to 2017. As I said, it's titled Hold the Line, and we'll link to it in the description of the episode so you can check it out for yourself. I'm not going to go through it line by line, but it's a really thoughtful and well put together piece that I think everyone should read. It really is sort of aligns with a lot of what we've spoken about over the last few years. I think the essential theme of the article is that to succeed in this sport, once an organisation believes it has the model it needs to be successful, it's really important to shut out the external noise, commit to that plan and process and see it through. And whilst that's no guarantee of success, it's more likely to be successful than changing direction after 2 or 3 years, only to do the same thing again 2 or 3 years later when results aren't immediate. I think my favourite part of the piece was as follows: because the hardest part of a rebuild isn't identifying the problem, it's living with the solution when it gets uncomfortable, when losses stack up, when progress isn't visibly externally, when the noise returns. So yeah, it's a really great piece from Tommy there. As I said, there'll be a link to it in the description. You really all should check it out.
Yeah, that line really stood out to me too, mate. We've been a club that has seemingly reacted to noise for a long time, not so much under the current admin, but we are also a club that generates a lot of noise, and it's been a little quieter this week, maybe helped by the second half against the Dogs, but probably also due more to the fact that there was a game on Monday and then a short turnaround into gather round, as well as our friends out at Princes Park getting a bit of attention too for losing another game where they were well up late into the games. Yeah, no doubt that noise is going to come through it at various points this season, and we're going to have to hold our nerve once again. I think the other thing that adds to that noise is two circumstances of history that aren't really at fault of, well, one's certainly not at fault, and that's the sort of 15, 16 years of failings that precede Brad Scott and the current administration. That's got nothing to do with them. And then the other one is the fact that we lost all of those games in the back half of last year when our list was decimated. So, those two things are being added to the current plight. And there's a lot of talk about, days since finals win, days since last win, or matches since last win, and those two things certainly create a lot of fodder and noise as well. So yeah, I think it's a really good article by Tommy, and it sort of slapped me in the face and felt that it was a really good reminder of just where we're at and what good and successful and strong clubs do to ultimately get the success that we're craving.
Yeah, indeed. I think, as I said, I really enjoyed the piece, and Tommy talks about the Richmond 2017 example as the one that most aligns with Essendon. I do like to hope that we are sort of on the same track that the Tigers went on in that build that they went through up until they did achieve success. But I certainly don't think that we're on the cusp of, a 2017 Richmond-like year now. I'd sort of put us back around the 2012 Richmond that was still developing. And I think the other big difference we have with that Richmond side is that even before 2017, they had clear A-grade talent on its list. Cochin, Martin, Rewalt, Rance, all had been All-Australian prior to their premiership year. I'm sure I'm forgetting something or someone as well. I'm not sure we have that collection of A-grade talent that is demonstrated consistently on field to say that we are on the same path as them, but I definitely do think that the model that they took getting to that point is definitely the one that we should be looking to emulate. And sort of as Tommy posits in his post, that's as much about what happens off field as it does on field.
Yeah, I think the comparison was probably made more in regards to the noise around Richmond and Hardwick at the end of 2016. They'd won 8 games. Hardwick had just completed his 7th season as coach, and the leadership of the club stuck to their plan and backed their man in, not without changes around him, but nonetheless, they kept backing in Dimmer as their senior coach. We're only year 4 under Brad Scott. Rosa has only had the full keys to the list management process for the last 2 draft periods. So I think the comparison is more about noise rather than the list position at the same time, directly. So yeah, at least that was the way I interpreted it.
Yeah, indeed. I think the other thing that the article made me think about is that we tend to focus on those rebuilds that worked. We often talk about the Richmond rebuild. We talk about what Melbourne did to get to their 2021 premiership. Brisbane, looking at what Brisbane did to get to where they are now. Okay, we tend to focus on the successful rebuilds. I think we don't tend to talk about the teams that tried to go down the rebuild route and failed. I actually think in the coming weeks it might be worth visiting this as a topic. Really take a look at those teams that failed the rebuild and why they failed and how we can avoid those problems that they went through there. So I think that's something we're going to probably cover in episodes in the future. So keep your ears out for that.
Yeah, I think, Richmond gets brought up a lot. Geelong under Bomber, Brisbane under Fagan, to a lesser extent, more recently, Adelaide under Nix. I know they didn't win a final last year, but they went from outside the 8 to finishing on top. I think they're all talked about as the models of stability, strength and alignment to rebuilding your club and your list. There's a club down the road from us in Essendon who, is probably the first one that we'll dig into, that had 3 number 1 picks in a row, invested in the draft, had access to high-end talent. And then just as that talent was starting to shine, they sacked their coach, brought in another one. Then they started to top up with players from other clubs, change their list management strategy, then change their coach again, change their list management strategy again, change their coach again, and continue to go around in circles. And currently, just having a quick look, 20 odd points down at halftime, which is nice to see. So I think that'll probably be the one that we'll look at. But of course, we can also look in our own backyard and see where that's got us to. But yeah, more pressing at the moment, mate. Let's have a look at the Ds.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at what the Demons did last year, they finished in 14th place, which was one ahead of Essendon. They had 7 wins and a percentage of 93.3%. Over the off-season, they had a change of coach and some key personnel. That has then seen the Demons make a strong start to this season. Currently sitting in 7th position with 3 wins against the Saints, Blues and Suns, whilst their only losses come against the Dockers.
Yeah, the performance from the Ds this year doesn't entirely surprise me, mate. And I think I've commented to people in the past that I thought they underachieved a little bit last year, because I do think that their list demographic was quite healthy. Injuries didn't help them at times, and obviously those question marks over Petraka and Oliver and what that was doing to culture. But I think despite the coach change, they've been pretty focused on turning over the list bit by bit, almost since they won the flag. They brought in Van Rooyen and McVie in their flag year in 2021. Both are now at 60 games. Of course, McVie's been traded to Fremantle, but I think it's an indication that they won a grand final and then invested in getting games into young players straight away. And they've continued to do that. They took 2 picks in the top 23 in 2023, which included Caleb Windsor, who's now at 40 games. And now, by virtue of having invested those games into him, he's now moved into to be a primary centre bounce midfielder for them in his 3rd season. They picked 6 and 11 in 2024, both of them whom played 20 games last year as well. So I think, throughout they've been focused on bringing in high-end talent, getting them into their system, getting games into them as well, and not just waiting until they bottom out before they have to rebuild their list. The other thing that they've done is they've continued to, and if you look at some of the guys like Windsor, Pickett more recently, and others, they've focused on guys that have speed and skill and brought them onto their list as well. So, yeah, as I said, not helped with injuries last year, but I do think they underperformed a little bit, and we're pretty well positioned to bounce back in 2026.
Indeed. Part of the reason why they struggled last year was they're struggling in terms of scores, and they're generally middling in terms of their scoring profile. They ranked 10th in scores for and 12th in scores against. This year, they've really improved their ability to score. They're up 17 points per game compared to last year and are currently ranked 5th. However, they've also seen a rise in their scores against. They're giving up 9 more points per game to their opposition. So they've really opened up their game style, and this has allowed them to score more. But it's also seen them scored against more. They've had both positive inside 50 differentials in the previous 2 seasons, but that has increased from plus 3.7 to plus 7. Their inside 50 efficiency has remained similar to last year, so most of their scores they're coming from just come from improved or increased numbers of inside 50, so they're still scoring the same rate. They go inside 50, but they've actually become much leakier the other way. They're currently giving up a score 56% of the time their opposition goes inside 50. That was compared to 51% last year. So this has all happened, and the change in their scoring profile has happened, even though their kick to handball ratios remain relatively similar to last year. They're going at 1.47 kicks per handball this year, which is basically the same as what they were doing last year.
Yeah, there's been a couple of changes. Actually, just one thing, if I can circle back to their list, mate, that's worth noting. They're the third oldest by average age in the competition this year, and the 5th most experienced list in the comp. So people are sort of, a lot of the narrative is around them, investing in young players and playing a lot of kids and freeing them up to play. But it's actually a list demographic that's primed to be successful now, not in future years. Against the Suns last week in that win, they had 6 players with more than 200 games experience to the Suns 3. Admittedly, they had 10 under 50 to the Suns 8, so not a huge difference there, but they do have a lot of top-end experience. But the thing that's changed the most about how they play, because they have sort of taken the handbrake off a little bit under their new coaching regime, is their ability to spread and punish on both clearance and turnover. And it's stoppage clearance rather than centre bounce. Stoppage scores are up almost a goal a game, whilst turnover scores are up 8 points a game so far this year. But it's also high risk. Turnover scores against are up 3 points a game, and stoppage scores against are up 11 points a game. So that stoppage score piece is a really interesting one to keep an eye on going into this week, and how we might set up and potentially be able to do some damage is that despite them opening up their scoring, as you said, they're opening up scores against as well.
Yeah, indeed. And their scoring ability from clearance has happened even though they've lost, their 2 best clearance players over the past half a decade or more in Oliver and Petrarca. They're currently 3.5 more centre clearances per game than their opponents, and they're ranked 3rd in the competition for that, and also 7th in scores from centre clearance with 12 points a game, so around 2 goals per game from centre clearance. Their stoppage clearance game is not as strong though. They're going at minus 2.2 per game, a drop from last year. Again, this is an area that could be exploited, though, given our performance this season, that is a challenge. The contested possession and ground ball game has also dropped away. They've gone from plus 10.8 in contested possession to minus 3 per game, and plus 2.6 to minus 10 in ground ball gets.
Yeah, they're plus 1 for centre clearance scores per game this season. So differential, that is. So they're largely breaking even, but they're minus 7.5 points per game from stoppage clearance scores. So yeah, it's an area where, despite them increasing their scoring rate, they're as I touched on and you touched on, their scores against are increasing too. So it's not quite Russian roulette with the way that they're playing. It's not that exposed, but yeah, we too have had issues in that area this year, and it's likely to be one of the main deciding factors in the game this week. We'd be hoping we see more of what we got in the second half last week than what we got in the first half.
Yeah, indeed. Finally, their marking profiles remain similar from last year. They're around minus 4 per game this season, and they're just above break even on marks inside 50 differential. So they're conceding about as many marks inside 50 as they are taking themselves. The intercept numbers are also similar to the previous year, so they're averaging plus 1.5 per game, and they've been actually scoring well from this. So they're averaging 54 points per game from turnover, which is the 6th best in the competition.
Well done catching your mic there, mate, before it fell off your desk. Well saved. Yeah, look, I think it might be partly down to Stephen May, obviously exiting their list, but their intercept mark numbers in the defensive half are down this season. They're still taking similar numbers to last year, but it's shifted to being below the AFL average for defensive half intercept marks, whereas they were above average and one of the better teams in that regard last year. They are above the average in forward half intercepts this season. So I don't necessarily think they're playing more of a forward half defensive game because that was already a feature, but they did have a couple of dominant aerial threats in May and Lever in that back half last year that they don't have this year, which I think segues into, their list changes because it wasn't just their coach that changed, mate. There was a fair bit of change to their list as well.
Indeed. You mentioned their new coach in Stephen King, but more than any other club, they made significant changes to their off-season or their list in the off-season. They had 12 departures, which was the most of any sides. Premiership stars Christian Petrarca and Clayton Oliver traded out, having played 23 and 22 games last year, respectively, whilst fellow 2021 Premiership player Charlie Spargo departed as a free agent. He played 10 last year. McVeigh, who you brought up earlier, was also traded to Fremantle after 17 games in 2025, and then a further 7 players were delisted, 3 of whom played games last year in Tom Fullerton, who played 2, Jack Billings and Tajwa Woden, who both played 1. And then finally, just prior to this season, Premiership defender Stephen May retired with 16 games in 2025. Having lost significant experience, the Demons were then active in the trade period. They brought in Jack Steele and Max Heath from St Kilda, Chunkov Jaff from Hawthorn and Brody Myercheck from Collingwood. Steele, Jaff and Myercheck have all played key roles in the Demons' early season form, whilst Heath is yet to feature. Like they have in the previous couple of years, they did take 2 first-round picks with Xavier Taylor and Latrell Pickett, sort of sandwiched between Essendon picks last year. Taylor was someone that was talked about as being picked up by Essendon. He hasn't debuted for the Demons this year, but Latrell Pickett has played all 4 games. Then took Thomas Matthews at 30, and Kalani White and Oscar Berry as rookies who are yet to debut, whilst SSP selection Paddy Cross has played 1 game.
Yeah, the Latrell Pickett has certainly added some excitement to their team. He's only averaging the 9 disposals and kicked just the 2 goals from his 4 games, but he's a player that is already showing signs of, the crowd lights up when he gets the ball. He makes opposition teams nervous when he's in the area, not too dissimilar to Cozzy when he first came into the Melbourne side. So, I think you're right. They targeted those experienced players for specific roles. We know what Myercheck has done and Steele have done for a considerable period of time. And then they bring in the excitement of someone like Latrell. It certainly added a much, a different dimension to their team.
Yeah, indeed. I think there's a lot of similarities with what Melbourne's doing at the moment with what McRae did for the Pies and in the way the Demons are playing at the moment. A team that have reached the pinnacle, obviously, they didn't win it under Buckley, but they got really close, the Pies, but they were declining under their previous coach. They've been reinvigorated by the new coach and some list changes. It will be interesting to see how they do go from here, given how positively they have started the season. Obviously, McRae won a premiership in his second year, and as you say, there's still a lot of experience on that Demons list with premiership credentials that with a little bit of rejigging could see them shoot back up the ladder.
Yeah, they've got 11 premiership players on their list, which is a great luxury for their young players to come through and play alongside. They've also added Myercheck to that, who won a flag at the Pies in 2023, and Steele, who's a 2-time All-Australian and 2-time Best and Fairest winner. So, yeah, as I said just before, they're the 3rd oldest list or oldest by average age in the competition and 5th most experience. And in context of them to where we're at, that's an additional 20 games of experience per player. So basically a whole AFL season. And as we keep saying, Humey, like if you think of where Kako is as a 20-game player and what he could be at a 40-game player, that's kind of the difference that we've got with where Melbourne is at the moment and the work that they've done over the last few years, really, to blood some young players, get them to 40 to 60 games, and then add some real experience to their list this year to I guess, replace what they've lost, but replace it in really specific roles. But yeah, let's take a look at selection, mate. What have we done?
Yeah, so there's 4 big changes for the Bombers this week. We've got Caddy and Ridley back from injury, with Ridley playing his first game for the year. We've got Elijah Sardis also emerging from exile to hopefully assist with our clearance issue. And most excitingly for Essendon fans, Sullivan Roby debuts, making him our 5th of the year and proving at least one of my pre-season predictions correct, that all 5 national draft players would debut by Anzac Day. So they've beaten that by a couple of weeks. So well done me. The 4 players have been omitted to that in Guelphy, Perkins, Johnson and Al Hooley. It is certainly going to be interesting structurally this week. We've dropped a small and a medium forward. We've dropped a halfback and a halfback wing rotation, and then brought in a key forward, a pure mid, a mid forward, and a third tall back. I think there's going to be a few other magnets swung around this week to make the structure work. It's really going to be interesting to see how they run out and structure up, especially against a side like the Demons we've talked about that is really running over the ground at the moment.
Yeah, there's only one true like for like there, isn't there, with Roby coming in for Perkins. And look, it's exciting to see Sullivan come in and play his first game. He had a delayed start to pre-season. We found that hot spot in his back after we drafted him, which wasn't there on the AFL medical reports. And he's been really patient, or the club's been really patient in building him up. He's played a few VFL games now, and quiet last week sort of dampened the expectations, I think, that we might see him this week because of that. But he had a really impactful game the week before. The rest don't make a lot of sense structurally. I thought we saw a side improve off making contest and pressure a feature of their game. Guelphy, I thought, had a big role in that after halftime. I'm not necessarily sure Guelphy is a solution going forward, but I think once they moved him off the Dale tag and he did a job as a pressure forward, he provided plenty of spirit. He's effectively replaced by Caddy. Caddy comes into that side, but I would have thought that we would look at moving a tall out for him. We now have a forward line that is going to at times contain Caddy, Edwards, and May. So that's an awfully big team. The benefit of that pressure that we got from Guelphy was that we saw Johnson and Al-Hooley get into the game the second half and do some damage by foot. And in Al-Hooley's case, added some leg speed as well. I think Ridley's been a culprit in years gone by of slow ball movements. I'm a little bit concerned that we might see a step backwards in how we're moving the ball because of their changes. I do think that Elijah should help us with our clearance challenges. It's been great to see him rewarded for form. I think he's knocked the door down enough now that he needed to be rewarded with selection. But how we balance that time up with our other mids and what that means for distribution on the outside, I'm struggling to get my head around that, but perhaps there's a couple of guys who are sore and maybe question marks over them, and we might see some late changes, and it makes a bit more sense once they run out on Saturday.
Indeed, and then looking at Melbourne, and as you'd expect from a team in form, they've made very few changes, or indeed just one, with Bailey Fritsch coming in for Bailey Laurie, so old Bailey coming in for new Bailey for the Demons this week, which really gives them an interesting and dangerous forward line, which we'll discuss in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, look, Fritsch is a real danger. He missed last week through injury. Let's hope he's a little bit underdone. It'd be nice. He's coming off 4 goals the week before. So, yeah, you're right. They're in good touch. So it makes sense that they don't make any changes. It was Laurie who came in for Fritsch last week, and then they've swapped that the other way around this week. So, yeah, speaking of last week, mate, let's quickly go through their win against the Suns.
Indeed, and it was a big scalp from the Demons. It was probably the game that really made people stand up and take notice of them. I guess beating the Saints and the Blues, for their previous 2 wins, were teams around their level from the previous year. But the Suns were undefeated going into that game, and the Demons managed to come out 20-point winners, even though the Suns took an early lead. But from halfway through the second quarter, the Demons were able to get in front, and it really kept the Suns at arm's length for the remainder of the game. Although looking at the scoring shots of 16-13 to 14-5, there probably should have been a greater margin given those 10 extra scoring shots. It really was the Demons dominating the game at centre clearance. They won 9 more than the Suns, and they outscored them from centre clearance by 15 points. And obviously, when you win centre clearance, you generally get territory. And that'll also allow the Demons to have 14 more inside 50s, which was also generated from 6 more intercepts. Although they did, something to think about, they did give up the 38 points to the Suns from forward half turnovers. So turnovers of them coming out of their defensive 50. So that is something to look out for this week.
Yeah, you're right. The Suns, when they were able to get field position, were able to do some real hurt on the Ds, but the Ds were plus 20 in contested possession. That was largely at clearance. So post-clearance contested possession, so that's once the ball gets out into space and it's in a contested situation, the differential was only 1. So, yeah, they were effectively plus 19 in contested possession at clearance. They dominated the Suns for first possession, winning that 51-24 and turned that into clearance territory and ultimately scores. The Ds had 8 more scoring shots from clearance, scoring 8-6 to 6 goals straight, and then 3-3 to 1 goal coming from the centre bounce. So it really was that stoppage and clearance game that was the difference between the two sides.
Indeed. And then looking at individuals, it was former Saint captain Jack Steele being immense there. He had 26 disposals, 8 tackles and 11 clearances. And Cosy Pickett, who is really doing a lot of damage in the midfield this year, he had 25 and 5 clearances. Former Bomber Jake Melksham, who will play his 250th game this week, was their most dangerous forward with 4 goals, whilst Brody Myercheck and Harvey Langford both kicked 2.
Yeah, and Jack Steele's been a solid addition to that midfield. He really is playing a key role as that primary, first possession midfielder, which then allows players like Cozzy to really get on the move and be quite aggressive and bring those other outside players into the game. So it will be a big feature or a big focus for us this week, that's for sure.
Indeed. I guess turning to the tactics for this week, we talked about in that Sun review of the Demons game against the Suns about how much work they did from clearance. And obviously last week against the Dogs, we were belted at centre clearance and the Demons, as I said, just put on a centre bounce clinic against the Sun. So how do we adjust what we did last week to not find ourselves in the same situation this week? And again, English is a great ruckman, but we're going up against a generational ruckman who still seems to be at the peak of his powers in Max Gawn. You'd almost be setting up to lose the tap in those centre bounces, whether it's Wright or Blackiston going up against him. I guess, is that a sustainable way to play the game, or do we have to try something different?
Yeah, it's probably not completely sustainable, mate. I do wonder whether the thinking is that Peter Wright will take more of the ruck duties and we effectively play and need to think of Wright and Blackiston as a dual ruck setup rather than Wright playing mostly forward and relief rucking. We've played 2 rucks against Gawn in the past successfully. I don't naturally like two ruckmen, but I think that sort of strategy potentially works this week against Gawn as it has in the past. And we've done that by kind of just nullifying his hit-out effectiveness through contesting against him in the air and then working him over around the ground. So I think, barring a late change that sees a tall out of the side, I think that has to be the plan this week. Is really just, he's still playing very, 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 very good football, Max, but he doesn't quite have the legs that he once did. So the 2 versus 1 is probably what gives us a chance to wear their most important player into the ground a little bit. I think it's really important that we hold that centre bounce structure, have that defensive sweeper in place, and ensure we don't have all 3 of our centre bounce mids going to the footy at the same time. We need to make sure that we've got that protection. We also want to make sure that our half forwards are coming in off the square pretty rapidly to give some level of pressure from behind, which is one thing that worries me about leaving Guelphy out, albeit we've seen Day Wicks do a good job in that regard, and we know that Kako can do that as well. So we're going to have to rely on them. Gresham is of course, the other one. And then I think we're just going to have to accept at times that Gawn is going to give them pretty incredible service and that we're going to be at pains to stop it. But what we need to do is make sure that doesn't turn into continued dominance. 1 or 2 offs, okay, but we don't want 3, 4, 5 goals in a row. And that balanced approach should really be designed to limit their first possession rate. It was only 2 weeks ago the D's lost first possession 43-27 to Fremantle. Melbourne won clearance by 3, but it wasn't clean exits. Melbourne scored just 10 points from clearance and 0 from centre bounce clearances. Freo outscored them in clearance scores by 26 points. I don't think you set up to lose. I think you need to be mindful that it's a big challenge. Steele is the key to their first possession. I think his opponent needs to be our primary hunter. We need to beat him to the footy. You can't necessarily tag a player like that or prevent them from getting it in a true defensive manner. I think you just need to be really focused on being first to the ball and restricting him that way. Gawn will take the ball out of the ruck a lot from stoppage, particularly in the forward half. So we need to be really competitive to prevent the ineffectiveness in that. And then Cozzy will get on the move, and that's where that defensive sweeper is really important to prevent his impact there. The Ds will set up to try and allow that space for Cozzy to move into, so we have to be prepared for that as well. So, yeah, I think that the 3 keys to their midfield setup are those 3, and we need plans for each, and then keep it pretty basic in and around the others.
Yeah. I think looking at their forward line, it's a really interesting mix. So Van Rooyen's probably the one who's playing as the traditional big forward, but he's only 193 centimetres. You got Myercheck, who did that role at the Pies as well, given their forward issues in previous years. You've got Bailey Fritsch, who's a really effective medium forward. Jake Melksham is a really difficult matchup and is also in really good form. You've got the Pickets, who you mentioned there. They're not a team at the moment that you can shut down 1 or 2 threats in their forward line. It's what's making them really dangerous going into this game.
Yeah, they're 4th in the AFL for marks inside 50. It's worth noting, mate, because he's playing mostly as a mid. So I'd like to say that makes it easier, but he's just as dangerous, if not more dangerous. And one of the best players in the competition at the moment playing as a midfielder. But again, go back to the Fremantle game. They kicked 4 goals between them. I know Freo are a lot better team than we are. They've got 2 strong ruck options and a really strong midfield, but it just does go to show the difference in effectiveness when supply is limited. And we saw that last week in our case against the Dogs. When contest and clearance is up, when pressure is up, defending gets a lot easier, and we just have to be, or we just have to get a more even performance from our mids and half forwards, simple plans, execute them well. And that's where the game is going to be won or lost this week. I think the team that gets more midfield dominance is going to win the match.
Yeah, indeed. We talked about it during the selection talk previously, but we've gone really tall this week with our forward line. We've got Caddy back to join Edwards. May Wright will spend time down there. We've got Langford playing higher up the ground as a wing. The Demons have been really quick with their ball movement, so I think the worry is that once the ball hits the deck with the way in which we've structured our team, we're going to find it really difficult to limit their ball movement from half back with a team we've named. Like, it's almost like if we don't mark it, we're in serious trouble.
Yeah, they're second in the AFL for turning a defensive 50 disposal chain into a score, which is certainly something that makes me nervous with the team that we've played. It's why I would have kept Guelphy in the side, because I think he can help in that. We just have to get deep entries, don't we? Whilst they are the second best team at defensive 50 transition into a score, they've also conceded the fourth most marks inside 50 this season and the second most forward 50 ground balls. So they do give you a look in. You said right at the start, they've increased their scoring, but they've also increased scores against. So look, I think we've got the balance wrong, but because I think deep entries also need to rely on kickers and ball speed, and we've left out two guys that can provide that. But if we can separate as a forward group, which we did well last week, we had 20 scoring shots from 36 entries, which is a great return. Now we want to get that up around 50 to 55 entries. Probably not going to have the same conversion rate, but that's okay. We just need to put their back six under pressure more often than we were able to do last week. And it's ultimately how we stop their ball movement, is to win it ourselves. It's the gamble we've taken with the team we've picked. We're going to have to be reliant on contest and clearance to give us territory, and then use that to expose their backs and cut off their ball movement before they even get it. I think that's what the coaches would have been looking at, the fact that they do concede a high number of marks inside 50 and a high number of forward 50 ground balls. So our forward line does have some threats there that can expose in both of those. It's going to depend on supply, though.
Indeed. And then just finally, sort of looking at their numbers and looking at the way which they've played, the Demons have been really happy to make games almost like shootouts and really backing themselves to outscore their opposition. So do we take them up with that, or do we have to try and deny them their scoring and sort of almost rope-a-dope them, really try and grind this game out, bring them down to our level, essentially?
Yeah, I think we have to grind, mate. I don't think we can be clinical enough when we have momentum to afford a shootout. I think, the Ds probably aren't at the Dogs level, at least not just yet. What they do have is the prowess to really hurt when they have momentum like the Dogs do. And I think that's going to create situations that if we go in with a shootout mentality, is going to allow them to put 5-6 goals on in a row. And we know that we aren't at this stage good enough to be able to do the same when we have momentum. So I really do think we need to make this a forward half game, through contest and pressure around the ball, and then using that to get the game in our forward half and setting up to prevent their score or their rebounds through being really competitive in the air.
Indeed. Just for the final thought tonight, we've talked a fair bit about Cozzy and the impact he's having on the Demons in the middle. Is obviously a really hard matchup with his pace and his ability to be a threat forward. And if he does start getting off the chain in this game, is this the situation where Andy McGrath needs to step up and take him all over the ground, follow him into the middle, kind of like what he did against the Sire last year? And I think that back half of the year when the Sire was one of the best players in the league, Andy McGrath was probably the player that did the best job at limiting the Sire's impact, and Cozzy and the Sire played similar style games? Or is there another option that you like in terms of going to Cozzy?
Yeah, I mean, Andy is probably the best suited to be able to do it. I think the worry is the flow on then down back and through the midfield, because if we put Andy into the midfield, we probably don't have a defender that's capable of going back to play a role on one of their other dangerous forwards, particularly given the changes that we've made this week. We haven't brought another small defender in. And then it also takes a midfielder out who's going to have to be slotted elsewhere. And in Caldwell, Sardis and Parrish, we kind of got three mids that can't really play, to all that effectively in other roles. So the flow-on effect there is a little bit worrisome. I wonder whether it's a learning opportunity, though, for Kako, and potentially we say, look, this is a development year. I know we're all craving a win, but the reality is this year is about finding out more and more about our list and our young players, and whether it's an opportunity to say to Isaac, Cozzy Pickett is the player that we think that you can be in the future. Go and see what it takes to be as good as him by trying to play on him and limiting him, and see if you can hurt him the other way. And that's the thing that probably Isaac can do that Andy can't, is do some real hurt the other way. So yeah, that might be the way that I'd think about going about it, mate.
Be an interesting matchup if we do see it on Saturday. Well, look, that will do us for another Bumper Donnerstad episode. Thanks for all your efforts tonight, Jono. If you're listening to this episode, maybe you've got it on the drive over to Adelaide, or you've queued it up before you get on your flight over to South Australia, and you're going to be at the game on Saturday, do reach out. Come and meet me up on the hill. We'll have a drink under the old scoreboard, and hopefully we get to celebrate an Essendon win. Any final words from you, Jono?
No, well, yes. Enjoy. Have a safe trip over. I know there's lots of the Donnerstadt community heading over, so hopefully there's a big crew of you there that can continue our pre-match catch-ups and do it over in Adelaide. And yeah, I hope everyone has a great time. And yeah, let's hope that we can take that second half performance last week into the start of this match and really build and breed some confidence in what we're doing and the way that we're going about things. It would be great to get a win on the board and a great reward for the fans who have headed over to Adelaide. We also have a really strong Essendon contingent already living in Adelaide and South Australia as well. So yeah, for all of you over there, let's hope you get to cheer on the boys to 4 points.
Absolutely, mate. Again, that'll do us for tonight. As always, stay safe, everyone. Go Dons.